What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by. Today's project is this Poulan Pro Blower that was given to me by a friend, and the problem is that it hasn't been used in a very long time because it was having some running issues. Let's take a good look at it, find out what's wrong with it, and hopefully we can fix it. In this video, we try and repair this blower. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. I am well aware of how this blower was used and cared for while my friend had it because, like most homeowners, these are viewed as tools that are meant to be used and abused, and it did its job for over a decade till it was put away for long-term storage, but to be honest, it does look pretty good for being 13 years old. I did service this blower several years ago, but I didn't bother filming it. I was also in the beginning stages of working with small engines, so I was very happy for the experience. I don't recall everything I did to it, but it doesn't matter because we're going to redo everything anyway. I normally begin these projects by trying to start the piece of equipment. However, there's really no point in this one because the fuel lines are broken, and since one of the fuel lines that sends fuel to the carb doesn't have the filter connected to it anymore, that means we need to remove the carb so we can inspect the inlet screen for debris that might have collected there. Even though we won't be able to give it a proper test start, we can still see if the engine works by putting some fuel into the carb's throat and trying to start it. If the engine does not start and run for a few seconds on the fuel we put into the carb, then we'll have to do more diagnostic work. Fortunately, the engine started and ran for a few seconds, which means we have a working ignition system and that the engine is not worn out. I did notice that the pull rope is having some retraction issues because it's a little slow to return. That's something we'll look at later on once we know the blower works like it's supposed to. Now, blowers have a very hard life, so I want to see just how much this engine is worn out by using a compression tester. Now, you can find these online for less than $20, and it will measure how much pressure an engine can make on the compression stroke. To use it, just remove the spark plug and install it into the engine, then pull the rope several times, and then the reading will tell you if the engine is worn out. A good reading would be about 130 to 150 psi, and anything less just means the engine has some wear on it. We do not want to see a reading below 65 psi. This must be the original spark plug and it's still holding up really well. The color on the electrode is exactly the color I want it to be. It shows that the engine was getting the proper amount of fuel the last time it was being used. So the reading is 145 psi, which is fantastic. That means that this engine is very healthy despite my friend never letting it warm up before using it. Although the only thing that saved it was the fact that it probably only used it after mowing and never on the leaves in the fall. The next thing to do is to remove the carb and inspect it for any issues. We're looking to see if either of the diaphragms has any problems. The reason we need to check it is because we don't know if the blower was put away in storage with fuel in the tank. The best way to put any two-cycle equipment away for long-term storage is to run them dry until there's nothing in the fuel system. The fuel line setup on this blower has the fuel filter line, which connects to the brass port further away from the purge bulb as the smaller line, while the larger line is the return line, which goes to the port next to the bulb. I don't think fuel line diameter matters on these carbs because I've done it either way. However, I'm going to replace the fuel lines the same way that I found them. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the pumping side of the carb where the purge bulb is, and what we're looking for is the condition of the inlet screen and whether or not it has debris on it. This round opening is where the screen sits, and it looks clear, but if you look on the side, you can see some debris sitting there. Now, I could use some compressed air to blow it out, however, I also need to test for fuel flow through the screen, but we'll do that here in a little bit. The next thing I'm going to do is inspect the pumping diaphragm's check valve flaps to see if they're bent away from being parallel with the rest of the diaphragm. The easiest way to check is to look at it from the side. On my first viewing, they seemed parallel because they weren't sticking away from the rest of the diaphragm. However, I didn't realize that they were bent in the opposite direction. Luckily, on this type of diaphragm, you can just bend them back. If this doesn't work, I'll just buy a new carb. The next step is to inspect the metering diaphragm underneath this metal cover. Its job is to control how much fuel will pass through the carb and into the engine. It's supposed to be soft and flexible so it can press against a spring-loaded rocker arm, but if it's beginning to harden or has wrinkles in it, its movements can be reduced or erratic and the engine won't run properly. This one's still flexible, but it has a few wrinkles in it, so I'm going to replace it. The original one would still work, however, it might not fully perform the way it's supposed to. After removing the diaphragm, I'll then carefully remove this tiny screw that holds the assembly in place. Just make sure you put your finger over the rocker arm, otherwise the spring will fly away. Now once the screw is gone, carefully remove the spring, needle, and rocker arm assembly. Don't lose these, otherwise you might as well buy a new carb. The next thing I'm going to do is spray the screen with some carb cleaner to get rid of the debris. This cleaning is going to do two things. First, it'll get rid of the debris that's on the screen, but the other thing is that it will test to see if the cleaner will flow through the screen. So it did flow through it, but it took a lot longer than it was supposed to, so I'm going to continue cleaning the screen until the flow improves. This might take several attempts, but after that I'll then put fuel on the screen pocket to see how long it takes to pass through it. After putting some fuel on the screen, I can see that the flow is a lot better. However, it could be just a little bit better, but it should improve once we start using the blower. So here's the new metering diaphragm, and it looks exactly like the other one except for one small part, which is just cosmetic. We just need to make sure that there are the same number of holes in it and that the stem in the middle is the same size as the original one. Most often the stem can either be long or short, and in this one it happens to be the longer version. Once I'm satisfied that I do have the correct metering diaphragm, I'll then replace the spring, the needle, and rocker arm assembly back onto the carb. This part can be very difficult because it's very easy to install the parts incorrectly. Now once the parts are back in the carb, press on the rocker arm to make sure that it's returning back to position and that it's lifting the needle. If it's not, you might have to do it again. Once that's done, we can now replace the metering diaphragm and the metal plate over it. If you're having a hard time finding the right metering diaphragm, then I would suggest replacing the carb instead. The reason I keep suggesting in replacing the carb is that the parts can be difficult to find for your carb, and the price for the rebuild kits are sometimes more expensive than getting one that's already assembled. Even though the old purge bulb was not broken, I'm still going to replace it. The reason is because these are not that expensive, and once they get discolored, they could break at any time. After that, I'll then replace the pumping side and the bulb, and then replace all the fasteners, and then we'll be ready to change the fuel lines. Changing the fuel lines doesn't take that much time, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it, but don't worry, it's really not that difficult. However, if you don't have some bent pliers, it might take a little bit longer. The larger white piece is the fuel filter, and it's in great condition. The reason I say that is the metal hasn't corroded yet. If the outside is corroding, that means the inside will be the same way. If yours is showing signs of pitting, I would then just replace it. The next part is a plastic splice that's only used to keep the return line from coming out of the tank. If yours doesn't have one, don't worry about it, you don't really need it. I'm going to be using two different fuel line sizes. The top one is the fuel filter line, and it's 140 thousandths of an inch. The lower one will be the return line, and it's going to be 3/16ths of an inch. The first line I'm going to run is the fuel filter line, and to help get it into the tank, I'm going to cut it at a sharp angle, then insert it into the smaller hole into the tank, reach in with my bent pliers, and work it into the tank. You'll want to work several inches into the tank, then pull out the end so we can cut the angle piece off. That way we can insert the fuel filter. Once that's done, we'll then put the filter back into the tank, then pull out any extra line, but just make sure there's enough line in the tank so that the filter sits near the front of the tank. Once the fuel filter line has been ran, I'm going to run the large return line. We'll just repeat the same steps we did before for the filter line, except this time we'll be installing the white plastic splice. I'll then pull on the fuel line until it stops. When it's all done, it should look something like this inside the fuel tank. The next thing we're going to do is cut the fuel lines a little longer than we need and then connect them to the carb. The smaller fuel line will connect to the brass port further away from the purge bulb, while the larger return line will connect to the brass port near the bulb. Before we install the carb, I'm going to put some fuel into the tank so we can test the flow through the lines. I'll do this test without the fuel cap on, that way you can see the fuel cycling through the system. So the fuel will flow through the filter into the smaller fuel line all the way up to the lower port on the carb. It will then fill up the purge bulb and then make its way out of the upper port through the large return line and back to the tank where it will come out of this plastic splice. So it took 10 presses to finally fill up the purge bulb and 17 to finally get the fuel to return back to the tank. That's pretty typical for a fuel system that's completely empty. Now the purge bulb is getting rid of the air in the system and filling it with fuel instead, just like it's supposed to. It does not prime the engine with any fuel to help start it. That job is left to the choke system. It's finally time to install the carb back onto the engine along with the air filter assembly. Once it's back on, we'll try and see if we can get it started. Now the air filter isn't dirty, but it's beginning to break down a little bit, so we'll have to replace it soon, but it should still work for right now. We may have to adjust the fuel settings on the carb to get it working like it's supposed to. For that part, we're going to need a special tool, and for this particular carb, we need to use the spline version, but yours might be different. You can buy kits which have several different types of tools online for a decent price. The fuel adjustment screws are easy to get to on this carb because they're right on top. The screw closer to the engine is the L screw, and it's for low engine speed fuel adjustment. It's also used to adjust fuel delivery when squeezing the trigger to go to full speed. The screw closer to the air filter is the H screw, and it's for high engine speed fuel adjustment, or basically when the trigger is fully squeezed. And the last adjustment screw is the Phillips head screw that adjusts the engine's idle speed. I think we're ready to try and start the blower and see if we need to make any adjustments. So we know the engine starts and runs for a few seconds, but it keeps stalling, which is not supposed to happen. So how is it supposed to act? In the full choke position, it's supposed to briefly start, but once in the half choke position, it's supposed to stay running until it warms up enough so we can move the choke lever to the run position. Since it won't stay running at idle speed, I'm going to adjust the L screw closer to the engine. Now most often the engine isn't getting enough fuel, and that's why it keeps stalling. To increase the amount of fuel to the engine, I'm going to turn the L screw counterclockwise, starting with a quarter turn, and we'll see if that keeps the engine from stalling. On the first attempt, after adding more fuel, the engine ran twice as long as before, which means it definitely wants more fuel to stay running. And on the second attempt, I moved the choke lever back slightly to manually introduce more fuel to the engine, and it ran just fine. That is, until I moved the choke lever back to the half choke position. It then eventually stalled. That means we need to add just a little bit more fuel at idle to keep it running. I'm going to turn the L screw another quarter turn counterclockwise, and hopefully it should stay running with the choke in the half position. After adjusting the carb, it seems to work really well now. I'll just let it cool down and then I'll do a cold start. That way we make sure the engine will start with its new settings. In the end, I ended up turning the L screw counterclockwise about half a turn and the H screw about 1/8 of a turn counterclockwise from their initial positions. Basically, in the end, the carb needed to send a little bit more fuel to the engine. However, those settings might need to be tweaked once more fuel has passed through the screen and the flow improves. Another reason why this carb would need to be adjusted is because these small passages in it have some buildup that's restricting fuel flow, but later on, once those passages have cleared, I might have to make some more tweaks to it to account for the extra flow. So my question is, would you ever buy or use a Poulan Pro Blower? Some people don't care for this brand at all. For whatever reason, they see this as a worthless brand and would rather use a leaf rake than this piece of equipment. Personally, I don't have a problem using it. However, when it comes to buying a new blower, this brand isn't even on my radar. I would rather buy an Echo, Steel, or Husqvarna blower instead. In other words, I would only buy it if it was really cheap. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions, and I hope to see you in the next video.